Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I was originally asked to talk about the global lessons from affordable housing policies around the world. However, because everybody in all of my trips in the last 4 years to India have said to me, Peter, housing, the yields are too low, forget it. And I'm talking about rental housing here. I mean, we've just had a panel where people have been talking about these sunrise sectors, very sexy emerging market sectors, and the yields are far more attractive, 8, 10, 12. How can housing possibly be of any interest to anybody in those circumstances? By which, again, I mean rental housing. So I thought I would look at the facts of the myth so that we could test this thesis. I mean, true or false? India's rental housing yields are too low to support a rental housing asset class, even at a time when we're finally getting REITs in this country. So when I think of rental housing as an asset class, I'm thinking from a private equity perspective or a securitized perspective. And so I thought that the lesson that would be interesting is not run through all of the affordable housing policies of Austria to Australia and Zambia, but rather to look at this fundamental economic equation that if we could take $500 billion USD of rental housing that is professionally managed in investment grade stock for the last 1.5 decades, which is as far back as we can go, for 10 countries, including all of the OECD countries, and look at the economic return from that massive sample size, would there be something to learn? Starting with what is the total return, so the income and the capital return combined, what is the total return on this massive global sample size of rental housing? Look at that, see how it's made up, and then ask the question, would this work in India? And spoiler alert, the answer is, yeah, obviously. So what we have here is a graph of it's a very simple graph, it's just the total returns from investment grade income producing residential assets for the last 1.5 decades from all of these G7 countries, excluding Italy, but 10 countries, from Sweden and the UK. And what you can see here is that the average annualized total return for, say, Sweden and the UK, a huge market, is about 10%. Every year, year in, year out, down to Japan, which is about 5.3%. Now, as no doubt the panelists after me will say, there are a huge range of sovereign bond levels in these countries. I mean, Japan, the cost of money is virtually zero. And so that total return spread is very attractive for Japan, but for Sweden, UK, Canada, a 10% return is also extremely attractive. And as I'll show in a minute, these returns are very stable. So that's a median total return of 7.7% total return, the income return plus the capital return over nearly 15 years, year in, year out. GFCs, locusts, storms, booms, the whole shooting match. So the question is, okay, so what sort of yields are experienced in these countries? To which my answer is, the yield is irrelevant, right? So the average yield that's quoted in the newspapers and by the real estate agents, nothing against real estate agents, some of them are my closest friends, but it's the income return there in the blue, which is quite a range from more than 60 or 70% of the total return down to about 1/3 of the total return. But here's the key number. In red, that little red bar, is what you'll read in the newspapers and all of the analyst reports as to the yield. So the yield, if you take the yield as your guide to whether a market can produce the sort of income streams and capital returns that make an asset class, then you'd never do it in any of these countries. And yet all of these countries have very successful, highly lucrative markets for rental housing. So the typical income return is 4.3%. And if you're looking at, so what's the difference between, say, the income return, which is the banked income stream year in, year out for these investment-grade assets compared to the yield, that's the difference. In Japan and the USA, which have the world's biggest rental housing asset markets, the income return is hugely higher than the yield. Yield's irrelevant. That's my main point. But those numbers I was showing you were investment grade, and they weren't REITs. These are the REITs. So let's look at America, which has the longest standing, biggest scale REIT market on the planet. And if we look at, right at the top there are the residential REIT returns, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You're not going to get a better sample than this. Long time frame, multifamily, single dwelling and manufactured housing, all income producing, all managed by REITs. That 5-year return, 11 and a bit, 10 years 10, 15 years about 12% total return, 20 years 12% total return. These are the annualized total returns for the REITs for residential. Residential is now the second biggest REIT asset class of the United States of America. It's not office, it's not industrial. Shopping centers are still the biggest and declining fast, and infrastructure is the third, but residential is the second largest with a bullet. It will soon become the largest asset class for REITs in the United States of America. And if you ask about Asia, what would those numbers be for Asia? The answer is, on a 10-year basis, that's as far back as we can go for Asian residential REITs, the total return annualized for 10 years is higher than America. It's about 13%. Highly attractive and very stable. This is just showing the volatility where the bluish, well, the dark bar is residential volatility, and offices, shopping centers, logistics, and whatever is the yellow. The lower the number, the better. So in most of those markets, the residential income-producing investment-grade housing as an asset class has a lower volatility than all of the traditional areas. That's not to say the traditional areas are no good. They're very attractive. But housing as an asset class delivers high returns and stability. This is why we have seen a revival of housing in most Western markets. And now China. So the Chinese government, Xi Jinping, said last October that I want a housing asset class. And I want REITs. So he said that in Mandarin, but the Mandarin for REITs is now REITs, which is big progress. He sees the REITs as an app for delivering levels of housing slightly lower than India's, but still an extraordinarily ambitious target also to drive their urbanization. And so what we've seen since last October is something like $6 billion USD of investment-grade housing REIT announcements. So the question I'm sure that's in your mind is, how do all of these countries with very low residential yields, like 2.9% on average, similar to yours, how do they have these high returns? And there's 7 reasons for this, and I'll go through them very quickly. One is scale. India doesn't lack scale. You have that exact same attribute as all the most successful markets. The second is labor market mobility and urbanization. You have a greater urbanization driver than any other country, and also labor market mobility. That is the key to the success in the US, by the way. People who want to rent apartments. And also, thirdly, that there are capital market structures that are fit for purpose in order to provide a place, a platform for rental housing, real estate to live in, both from a private equity side, direct ownership, and also securitization. So they're the macro factors. But what is really driving the difference in the total returns compared to an old-fashioned, boring old yield perspective is smart asset selection. The good apartments, the good homes are in those funds. It's that simple. Secondly, that there is very smart capital management. So a lower cost of capital, more efficiently managed, and also asset recycling. And sometimes schemes whereby the renters are given the opportunity, if they look after the apartment, thereby lowering maintenance costs, which can be a killer, to one day own those apartments, so then those assets can be recycled at a massive scale. And brilliant professional management, good partnerships, usually with community organisations, local government, and then government support. An integrated menu of incentives. And that is what creates an attractive investment return that is a magnet for capital. So these aren't isolated examples. These are 1 million plus homes, $500 billion worth of funds under management, 10 countries, a brilliant sample size, all of the G7 countries except Italy. And the housing policy innovation, my final slide here, which is basically where government and the industry put together a platform, a capital markets platform to drive and support these returns, fall into these 4 categories. Debt bond aggregators, this is very popular in Europe, it's just been launched now in Australia, where instead of expecting local community organisations and metropolitan councils and developers to issue their own corporate bonds, that they are aggregated into massive pools which are backed by the governments and issued with much longer tenors at a lower cost of capital. This is a very innovative, very successful policy system. I don't need to talk about REITs and InVEETs. You've got them now. They're going to work, especially as the government has been brilliant at putting the affordable housing component in the InVEET column. Shared equity and reverse mortgages, I won't go into depth on those, but they're worth looking into because they work for the younger portion of the population as well as the older portion of the population so that they can be more independent. And finally, direct government support. By that, I don't mean just handouts and government signing checks. The government of Singapore actually has quite a rich, innovative menu of incentives. Of course, the point I made before about Japan and the United States, the more free market a country, the more the government is a big player in creating a rental housing asset class with a big affordable component. So the US is not hands-off. The US has more intervention, more incentives, more market leadership than any other country. Even under Donald Trump, he's not dismantled any of it. Right? So this emphasizes the important role of government partnerships with the private sector and non-government organizations. But the biggest lesson in any country is the government involvement is less fiscal. It's ensuring there's an integrated set of incentives where the most important is to make sure that the strategic planning scheme, development control, development assessment is as efficient as possible so that it doesn't act as an artificial tax by delaying the supply of all homes, including affordable homes, to the marketplace. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was asked to talk about the global lessons. We've seen that all countries have low housing yields, all of them. The more successful they are, the lower the yields. It's irrelevant. If there are the key drivers that I mentioned before, scale, efficient capital management, smart selection of assets, a good capital markets platform, then it's possible to create very strong, very stable income streams which perform year in, year out, as we've seen from these numbers, and deliver very attractive returns, total returns, but also the income stable returns that will attract the pension funds and the insurers and the sovereign wealth funds as well as the rest of the market. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.